Hello, my name is Jim Winkler, and I serve as President and General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. I welcome you to this COVID-19 webinar, Vaccines, the Role of Faith Groups, and How to Stay Safe. We've endured a great hardship over the past year. We've lost more than 600,000 people to this global pandemic in the United States and nearly 3 million worldwide. Just this very morning, less than 2 hours ago, my family held a funeral for my Uncle Ray, who passed away due to COVID-19. Grief has struck home for me, and I know it has struck home for many of you as well. Today, we have, I believe, a rich and full webinar for you, filled with valuable information on how to stay safe, how to prepare for your house of worship to open again, what vaccines are safe, many other parts to this webinar I think you'll find very, very informative, and I welcome you. But before we get started, would you please join me for a moment of silence? Amen. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was Jim Winkler, President and General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. We welcome you today to our webinar. We have been planning to do something like this since at least October, and we're really glad that this great panel of experts has joined us as we talk about the vaccines, the role of faith groups, and how to stay safe. We want to get started right away with two who will come and just help us understand the vaccines themselves, vaccine basics, really. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Uzma Syed, who is an infectious diseases physician, chair of the COVID-19 task force at Good Samaritan Hospital Medical Center, and director of antimicrobial stewardship, the Microbiome Stewardship Center of Excellence. I hope I got that right. I should pause and just say each of our panelists has an extensive background, and we could have a webinar with each of them for at least 2 hours, but we will keep to our time and to glean from their expertise just in these moments that we have together. We also have Dr. Nathaniel Smith, who is Deputy Director for Public Health Service and Implementation Science for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. He is also a minister in the Anglican Church, which is not, this is probably putting together two parts of his life that are not normally joined together, but we're grateful for both of you for being here with us today. If we could just get started, could you just tell us, there's so much information out there, so many things that we've heard and been misinformed about and well-informed about, but could you just clear up for us some information about the vaccines that are available and how they were able to become available so quickly? I know those are some of the questions we hear all the time. Dr. Syed, why don't we start with you?
Sure, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having this much needed forum. And as you stated so eloquently, it's really important that we continue to share the facts and help debunk some of those myths that unfortunately keep spreading out there, because more than a year into this pandemic and being on the front lines, I can tell you that the amount of despair, disability, and death that I see on a daily basis is unlike anything other we've seen in our lives. And although we've made so much progress and so much advancement advancement in science, on the COVID-19 front, we still, a year later, do not have a magic bullet or a cure for this. So vaccines really are the strongest tool that we have right now in our toolbox. So it's really important that people are informed and have all the accurate information so that we can really have this pandemic behind us. So people often ask, were these vaccines rushed and how did we get to having this vaccine become available so quickly? So in December of 2019 is when we first learned about the outbreak with this novel coronavirus. And what was remarkable was by January 10th, the sequence of this novel coronavirus was made publicly available. Now, the second that sequence was made available globally, scientists around the world went to work working on vaccine development. The things that they had on their side was science. All the advancements that we've made over the years. We've had experience with other coronaviruses before. We've had outbreaks with SARS, we've had experience with MERS. Now, none of these previous coronaviruses got to the scale of this novel coronavirus, of this global pandemic. So we never got to this stage before, but we have studied these coronaviruses before, and we had so much science to really help us and guide us. That, along with the fact that we have worked on these vaccine platforms before. So these are not novel vaccine platforms. So the messenger RNA platform, which we have right now with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, that has been studied for decades. It's been used for Zika, for CMV, it's been used for cancer therapeutics. So it's not something that just came into existence in 2020. It's something that we, again, have a lot of research on, have a lot of experience with. And then the fact that the entire global community came together for a singular purpose to really work on vaccine development, science advancement, to really make an impact in this pandemic because of the tremendous amount of lives they're losing every single day. All of those things coming together, really working on efficiency and making sure that we are still going through all of the phases of the clinical trials the way we normally do, without compromising any safety, while making sure that these vaccines are efficient and that they in fact are safe at every step of the way, with independent bodies really carefully evaluating these vaccine candidates. That's how we started with, the vaccine development from January 10th, leading to March, where we had the first vaccine candidate that became available to start our clinical trials. And we have to also remember that these vaccine candidates are first studied in animals to make sure that they're safe and effective, and then they start the trials in humans. So there's a whole scientific process behind this, in which the safety of these candidates, of any vaccine candidate, has not been compromised. And in fact, there's been tremendous scrutiny on looking at these at every stage, at every step of the way, to make sure that there are no major red flags, no major safety issues. And that's where we got to the fact that these vaccine candidates were screened, were vetted, met all the safety criteria, were then presented to the FDA, received emergency use authorization. And because of the entire global community coming together and investing so much into vaccine development, we were already ahead of the game by having a lot of these vaccines already in development, so that once they were approved by the FDA, we actually had vaccines available to start vaccinating people. And that's what has helped us get to where we are today.
Great. Dr. Smith, I don't know if there's something you want to add, but also maybe begin to just talk about the differences with the vaccines that we have available now.
Certainly, and Dr. Syed has given an excellent overview. I might add to that one of the things that tends to lengthen the process of vaccine development is that usually a vaccine is developed and then it's tested, and then only after that testing has proved its safety and going to manufacture that process. Manufacturing began even before these vaccines received their emergency use authorization, so that as soon as they were authorized, there was vaccine available to use. Now, normally, manufacturer wouldn't do that because there's too much financial risk, but because of the partnership with the federal government, they were able to do that. And I would add that, as Dr. Syed has said, there was research going on for two similar viruses. One, the virus that causes SARS, that caused a severe outbreak years ago, and then also Mediterranean MERS coronavirus, which is a similar virus. Again, those have not caused ongoing outbreaks like we have with COVID-19, but there was a lot of research that had gone into that. So we sort of had a running start on this. And then, of course, the fact that these vaccines worked the first time was an amazing provenance there. I know that we've been working on vaccines for some other infectious diseases like HIV for decades and still haven't come up with one that was highly effective. But this one, it worked the first time. So these, the reason why we're having a conversation about how quickly it developed is largely due to that factor, the provenance there. Now there are 3 vaccines out there currently that have emergency use authorization here in the United States. The first of those was the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, followed shortly thereafter by the Moderna vaccine. And both of these use the messenger RNA technology that Dr. Syed mentioned. Basically, the messenger RNA enters the cells, not the nucleus of the cell. It doesn't change the genetic structure of the cell, but that messenger RNA is used by the cell to produce the protein that gives the immune system the ability to develop a response. Normally, we would inject the protein itself, but the messenger RNA allows the cell to produce those proteins and elicit that immune response so that people's immune systems are prepared for the virus. The Johnson & Johnson virus vaccine uses a slightly different technology. It uses what we call a vector. It's a very modified version of another virus that allows that the vaccine component to enter the cell, and it works in a similar way. And again, both these technologies have advances over that have been used and studied for years or decades in the development of other vaccines.
Great. And just to ask both of you, should anyone say no to Johnson & Johnson versus Pfizer versus Moderna, what would your response be to someone who said, well, I just want 1 shot, or I want 2 shots, or Pfizer was first, or some other? What would your response be?
I think the thing that's really important to remember is that all 3 of these vaccines, as I mentioned before, have really gone through tremendous scrutiny with safety and efficacy, and they're really well tolerated with no major safety concerns reported. As I also mentioned before, with the pandemic and the scale of the pandemic, with the amount of virus that we still have circulating in our communities and the amount of people that are still succumbing to illness and hospitalization and death, we have 3 vaccines that have all been proven to be safe, effective, to prevent severe COVID-19, to prevent hospitalizations, and to prevent death. And those endpoints are really remarkable and really something that we should strive to achieve for everyone. Now, once we have the ability of having, a surplus of vaccines where it's not a race against the virus, not a race against the variants, then that would be a scenario where you might be able to offer people choices. But right now, the main thing for people to remember, because of the urgency in the situation and how quickly we need to get people vaccinated so that we can prevent them from getting ill from COVID-19 and to save more lives, is for really to offer people the vaccine as quickly as they possibly can get. And what I usually recommend to people is get the vaccine that is first offered to you, because these are life-saving vaccines, and they have all been proven to be safe, effective, and to really save lives. And they've been well tolerated. Nobody has died from a COVID-19 vaccine, but people are dying from COVID-19. So that's something that I really emphasize to people. And another point that I like to also make is that there is no coronavirus, you cannot contract SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 from the vaccine. There's no killed virus in there. There's no live virus in there. So people often hear misinformation that they're afraid to get the vaccine because there is actually some component of the virus in there and they might catch the virus that way. That's actually false. So that's really important to remember.
Dr. Smith,
Absolutely. I agree with what Dr. Yes, I agree with what Dr. Syed has said 100%. The best vaccine is the first one that you can get. Like any other prevention measure, it works a whole lot better if you get it before you're exposed. So getting a great vaccine too late is not nearly as good as getting the first vaccine. But all of these vaccines are safe and effective. So there's not a bad choice amongst them. One slight difference at this time is that the Pfizer vaccine is approved down to age 16. So for those who are 16 to 18 years of age, really it's the Pfizer vaccine at this point, Moderna, and they're going on in children, and hopefully we'll see vaccine available to children before too long.
so let me ask this question. Are there any preconditions for which you should not take the vaccines? And then if both of you could just talk about some of the side effects, once you get the vaccine, what should people expect in terms of side effects that they might have following having the vaccine administered to them? So anybody who really they should not take the vaccine that we know of at this point, any pre-existing conditions, and then what are some of the side effects that people might expect once they get the vaccines? Dr. Smith, why don't you start and then we'll go to Dr. Syed.
Sure. The only condition that would be a reason not to get the vaccine is a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine, to any of the components of the vaccine. So most people, the vast majority of people are eligible for the vaccine. As I mentioned, until we have authorization for children, children less than 16 will need to wait. But the only contraindication, the only reason not to get it is a severe allergic reaction to one of the components of the vaccine. Now, in terms of side effects, most people don't have significant side effects with these vaccines. If they do, it tends to be younger people. Older people tend to have fewer side effects, and it tends to be more with the second dose for the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines where you get a second dose. I'll just briefly share my personal experience. When I got my first dose, I had really no side effects at all. After the second dose, I had some soreness in my arm at the injection site, which is pretty typical. My wife, who's a practicing physician, when she got her first dose, she had some soreness in her arm. After her second dose, she had to go lie down, take a nap, which is really unusual for my wife. She's very high energy. After she woke up, she felt fine. But these are the kinds of reactions that people might experience. Dr. Syed, maybe if you could share your experience with individuals that you've vaccinated.
Absolutely. Agree with you completely, Dr. Smith. So, the only people that are really essentially precluded from getting vaccinated are those that have these severe allergies to the vaccine components. And by that, it's, anaphylaxis, sort of throat closing sensation, trouble breathing, swelling. And, the main component that's of concern is something called polyethylene glycol, which is Miralax. So if you know you have a severe allergy to Miralax, then that would be a person that essentially couldn't get that vaccine. But aside that, we've heard previously about allergic reactions to these vaccinations. I think the thing that's really important to remember is that is still a very rare occurrence. It's been reported as about 2.5 per million cases for Moderna and maybe 5 per million cases for Pfizer, and essentially probably much lower than that now that we've been vaccinating more and more people. Millions of people are getting these vaccines daily, so those numbers are even lower. But the important thing to remember is that anybody that develops a reaction to this vaccine, even though extremely rare, they are all treated immediately. Most of these reactions happen within the first 15 minutes, which is why any patient of mine that I ever vaccinate for any immunization, I always observe, whether it's COVID-19 or shingles or any other vaccine that I might be giving to a patient of mine, I always observe them for at least 15 minutes to make sure that there's no reaction. Again, it's rare, but it can happen, unknowingly. So all of those reactions are treatable. And again, as I mentioned before, nobody has died from the vaccinations. As far as side effects from these vaccines are what we call reactogenic vaccines, meaning that they do elicit a reactive response from your body. That's actually expected, and it's a normal response. It means that your body, your immune system is working, you are developing antibodies. But I always tell people that you should expect some of these, because don't be alarmed. If you don't have that conversation with people, they could be very frightened if, 12 to 24 hours after getting a vaccine, all of a sudden they have high fevers, shakes, chills, they feel like flu-like symptoms, and they're really worried. These are to be expected for up to 48 hours after vaccination. Again, more common, as Dr. Smith mentioned, after the second dose than the first dose, and certainly more common in younger people, but anybody can have these. And again, it could be fever, chills, body aches, soreness at the injection site. All of these things are to be expected. The important thing is, again, they're treatable. You can take Tylenol, you can take Motrin, whatever works for you to really help you get comfortable and get through the symptoms. And you know that this is only a very short-lived thing for about 48 hours, and then those symptoms dissipate. But essentially, it's not something that's going wrong. It's actually how your body's supposed to work. So we know that these vaccines have these side effects. And in fact, most people, anyone can report any side effect from a vaccine on the CDC website, and that's all transparent. So we make sure that you have access to this. If you just go online, and I'm sure Dr. Smith can speak to that, we can see what percentage of people that are getting vaccinated are reporting fevers, what percentage are reporting a pain in the arm. So all of these things are, extremely transparent. And these are things that we expect to happen. Not everybody that gets a vaccine will have a reaction, but if you go in prepared, I usually tell all my patients, try to schedule your vaccination maybe on a Friday or on a day where you may not have to work the next 2 days, or have a backup plan in place so that if you don't feel well, at least, you have some measures in place where you have that time to take off to rest at home for those 48 hours.
Great, that's really helpful. I want to just ask two last questions. I know we could probably spend a lot more time. One is just a quick question. We have heard that some people are saying they're going to take the first shot and not take the second. If you could just talk about why you want to take both, and then tell us a little bit about, briefly about the variants, and if the vaccines will work against the variants, and what our expectations should be of how the variants should be dealt with moving forward. I will start with, I guess, Dr. Syed, and then go to Dr. Smith.
Absolutely. So as far as completing the vaccine series, so the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a single dose vaccine. So one dose would be sufficient for that. That's how it was studied, and that's what the data we have supporting that. Both the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna vaccines are 2 series vaccines. So the data that we have is showing, roughly 95% efficacy in both of these messenger RNA vaccines with 2 vaccine doses, at the intervals that they have for either 3 weeks or 4 weeks, depending on which one you get. And about 2 weeks after your second dose is when you have really adequate immunity. So if you're not going to go through with the second dose, you really are partially protected, and there's no guarantee that you are going to have any protection really if you come into contact with somebody that's actively infectious, as has COVID, and you can in fact contract it. That one vaccine is not going to give you enough protection. So it's really recommended that you get the 2 series vaccine if you're getting the messenger RNA vaccines. as they have been studied, because we have really strong data that shows, for a vaccine to be that effective, we have to follow the science. So that's really the recommendation. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? The variants, right? So the variants, so we have a lot of data that's constantly emerging on these variants. As we know, we have at least 5 variants of concern that have been, described globally and even nationally. We have in California and in New York variants that are now emerging, in addition to the B.1.1.7 that was first discovered in the UK, and the B.1.351 first discovered in South Africa, and the P.1 in Brazil. So all of these variants, the vaccine manufacturers actually, once they first completed their studies and we heard about the B.1.1.7, both Pfizer and Moderna started testing their vaccines in the labs against these variants, and they found that they were eliciting good enough response. For the B.1.351, which is the one in South Africa, they did note that there was a decreased level of antibody that was elicited in the lab, but the amount of antibody that is elicited from these vaccinations is so robust and so high that they think that it's still sufficient to provide protection against these variants. Now, the J&J vaccine had less efficacy in South Africa because 95% of the population there that was infected in the trials had the B.1.351 variant there. But what we have to remember is this vaccine was still effective in preventing severe COVID-19, preventing hospitalization, and preventing death. So we're still, what that means is that people may still get infected if they have that, if they're exposed to that variant, especially in South Africa, but it will be a mild illness. So when you're talking about a novel virus that we have no cure for, which is killing thousands and thousands of people every day, and you get vaccinated and turn that into a very mild, say, cold, this is really a win-win situation. And that's what we have to remember. As more variants are discovered, we're going to expect that there will be more data. And we are learning in real time, actually, with the vaccination efforts that are happening globally. We have a lot of data out of Israel. We have a lot of data out of the US also that is showing that these vaccines are effective against a good number of these variants, but we don't have all the data on all the variants that are emerging right now. So, there's a lot of things in flux right now. These vaccine manufacturers are actually testing booster vaccines that are targeted specifically to these variants. The great thing about these vaccines is that they can be tweaked very quickly, very easily. So there may be a scenario where we may need a booster to, cover a variant that may be the most common variant that we have circulating if these vaccines are not effective for that. Right now, we don't have a reason to think that, but we will know more as time goes forward. So the goal is to vaccinate as quickly as possible and get ahead of these variants so that we don't have, if the virus doesn't keep spreading, if it doesn't have a host to transmit to, then it won't mutate, then we won't have more variants. So that's really the end goal in all of this, is to stop this virus from spreading.
Dr. Smith, yes, if you, I don't know if you have something to add, and then, help us with the variants and the second dose.
Yeah, Dr. Syed covered that very, very well. I just would underscore that the main variant that we're concerned about right now in terms of numbers in the US is the B.1.1.7 variant, sometimes called the UK variant. That's the one where we have the greatest numbers right now and seems to be increasing the fastest. And it seems like it looks like the vaccines that we have available to us now are fully protective against that. Dr. Syed said there's some other ones that there's more concern, but these vaccines do seem to be protective, especially if they, with the mRNA vaccines, when you get both doses. Again, most people do come back for that second dose, and we highly recommend it because, also we want people not only to have a good immune response, but that immune response to last as long as possible. It may be that as time goes on and learn more, that there may be different guidance that we can put out. But right now, it's best to use these things the way they were studied so that we know people are getting that high level of protection, especially since there are some of these other variants around where we need as much protection as possible.
Great. Thank you both so much. That was wonderful. I wish we had more time. We're going to transition a little bit to our next topic. And we know that you'll be with us for a little bit and may have to call back on you to answer a couple of questions. But thank you. That was so very helpful. Now we're going to just turn to talk about access to vaccines and what faith groups are doing. To have that discussion, we're talking to Reverend Brenda Gertin Mitchell, who was once the director of the Washington office for NCC and now serves on our Racial Justice Task Force. But she is in this role, a new role, that she is working with the Conference of National Black Churches as the Trusted Spaces, Trusted Voices, Trusted Content project manager, which is a program that is working with churches on vaccine distribution. And also Bishop Daniel Gutierrez, who is the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Philadelphia. So thank you both for joining us. We're so glad to have you with us. We know that you've both really been on the front lines and on the ground and maybe in a virtual sense, but still on the ground in some ways, helping faith groups and faith communities with vaccine distribution. First, Bishop Gutierrez, I'll turn to you. And then Reverend Brenda, if you could jump in too with how faith communities can be involved with vaccine distribution. I know your church did a major effort, Bishop Gutierrez, in Philadelphia. If you could just talk about that.
Thank you for the invitation. It's important. Clergy often forgotten faith communities because we often step into the breach where first responders run toward danger. Clergy runs towards the pain. And so this is our ministry of presence. And I think that's what we do as clergy. We have to be present to one another and present to the entire community. And so one of the first things that the amazing staff of the Episcopal Diocese of Pennsylvania engaged in was developing a plan for vaccinating our clergy. We weren't on the 1B register, and we believe that if we're visiting shut-ins, if we're providing last rites, if we're visiting hospitals, funerals, there's a sense of security not only for our clergy, but for the people we visit. So we coordinated an effort to get our clergy vaccinated. And we had over 700 of our own Episcopal clergy vaccinated. And it was a relief to our clergy because they are out there. And because when people are hungry, hunger doesn't stop because of the virus. When people are sick, and we've seen it, it just intensifies and magnifies. And now we are going through a series. Once we got put on the list by calling the governor and the Commonwealth, we had the clergy vaccinated, and then we're going into all our communities, especially underserved communities. Philadelphia has a large Black and Latino population, and there is that mistrust. And we're trying to use the trust that we have built with the community to accentuate the trust with the vaccine.
Great. Reverend Brenda, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for this opportunity. One of the ways to get involved is just to say you're ready, you're willing. Because none of us really knows how this is going to work out in the long term. But for me, it was so personal. I was waking up in the middle of the night after losing a cousin to the virus, after my oldest brother seemed like he was losing his mind during the COVID experience. His became psychotic kind of reactions. At 91, he got better and was able to go back home. But every day it seemed like somebody close to me in my church family and my blood family and my friend families have been impacted. And the Holy Spirit kept saying, you need to be doing something. But I didn't know what to do. So I just started talking to other people to say, what can we do as people of God to help people understand they need to be tested, they need to learn whether this vaccine is appropriate for them, they need to be educated, we need to be voices on the ground. And in the midst of those conversations, the cross-pollination started, and I found out that the Conference of National Black Churches, I was trying to raise some money for the Progressive National Baptists to get involved in educating people on the ground, people that the church members would trust, people that they know, people that already had faces that they respected even in this virtual world. The Conference of National Black Churches had already been awarded from the CDC, thank you, Dr. Smith, a grant to help promote education, and they named the initial program Trusted Voices, Trusted Content, Trusted Spaces, saying that in the Black community, especially African American community, people rely on the church as a place of trust. They rely on their pastors. And in our spirit of humility as faith organizations, sometimes we don't say that we're doing good work because that sounds like we're bragging. But God has given us some agency to help people in the ways the bishop referred to. There's a Matthew 25 component to everything that we do in making sure we hear the cries and the needs of those who need to be served. But all of us don't know. This is so new. We need to be educated, to be competent enough to be voices in this space. The Conference of National Black Churches, as you know, is about 30 years old, represents 80% of African American Christians who self-identify as such, and have been awarded as one of 3 national organizations, National Urban League, National Council of Negro Women, National Conference of Black Churches, have been awarded these funds to help be trusted messengers, to reach people where they are, and to be able to go to people, if you will, even virtually, to answer their questions, to hear their concerns, to find out those things that are holding people back, that make them reluctant to participate in the vaccine. And we're not telling people what to do, we're giving them the kind of information that you're sharing here today, Dr. Copeland. And I think that's so important. And if people don't feel that it's safe to ask questions, then they can't trust the system. So we're saying ask every question that you have. And if we don't know the answers, we're going to be working together to find them. But if you just take that in and act out of fear, and we don't even want to say God does not give us a spirit of fear. Hey, this is real. And if we ignore it and we're dismissive of it, we won't have the opportunities to help people get the answers that they need, the science-based answers. And yeah, we're going to pray with you, but we're going to teach you what's available and learn from voices like Dr. Saeed and Dr. Smith are sharing with us today. So leading people to information. And then lastly, I'll say for the conference, representing the 7 largest African-American denominations, that's a collaborative opportunity. And if all of us are working together, there's enough work to go around. We're sharing the same or similar messages, and we're helping people to see that there's a place that they can go and even get confirmation or affirmation about the information if they're still in doubt. And if all of us are starting to say the same thing, we're pointing back to the same intelligence around this issue of vaccines, it will help people have more confidence in doing it. And I think the other thing that's so valid, I've had both of my shots, the testimony. This is real. I had both of mine. 2 weeks Friday was my 2-week time. I had a little bit of soreness in the site. And I'm not even sure that my exhaustion was from the shot. I think I was just, but both times I had given myself permission to come home and take a nap, and I was fine. And so being able to share on our prayer calls at church and with people who know and trust me, that I did okay. I didn't, and I was anxious, I was a little anxious, but I didn't get sick. And I'm protected in a way now. And I do the first responder stuff, and I am in charge of the food pantry. And so just giving real life examples, I think does help people. And saying that we're doing it because we believe God has also provided us an opportunity for healing and wholeness. There is a way out, and we have to shine our light in the midst of this information darkness so people won't let the fear of the past. We can help destigmatize the information and help people move forward to a healthier future, even in the midst of this pandemic.
Bishop Gutierrez and Reverend Brenda, that was really helpful. I wonder if you could talk about what type of safety or protocols or any wisdom you have for that congregation, that house of worship that says, we want to do this, but they also want to be prepared. They want to prepare their people to help. They want to make sure that the proper protocols are in place. Or what guidance would you give them if they say, yes, Reverend Brenda, I am on board. How do they begin?
Dr. Smith will have a good answer for this, but I mean, the CDC has become my go-to site for starters on everything. And right on their website, they have the frequently asked questions, the COVID collaborative. If you want to get involved, here's the basics. And since Bishop Gutierrez has already done this work in the flesh, I would defer now to him for the response of what it was actually like getting your local affiliates to allow you to participate as a church.
What we did was there immediately last March, as soon as March 13th, when we got the thing, we shut down in that initial surge. But as I said, we have faithful people working on the diocesan staff. We immediately wanted to be proactive, taking into account science, also trusting in God. So we spent hours upon hours, days upon days, listening to people from CDC, the healthcare professionals, and we developed a 27-page protocol for each one of our churches. And I sort of used, which is nice in a liturgical Episcopal tradition, the power of the bishop, that they could not open or close or move without permission from me, seeing that they met all the protocols, the masking, the distancing, the ventilation, and that's still in place. And we're following a phased, color-coded 1, 2, 3. For Easter, we're going to revised phase 3, which allows 50% capacity. But we watch this weekly. We take this seriously. And I visit congregations by Zoom, all of it. We're the 4th largest diocese in the Episcopal Church. And I tell them, I would much prefer for you to criticize me for being careful, being conservative, than doing one funeral for any one of the members of my churches. Mm-hmm. I just can't take that chance. And if I'm flippant about it, I'm not a shepherd. I'm not showing the love of Christ. And so we have protocols and we're revising them. But I didn't do it. It was this faithful staff that I have working and serving people of the Diocese of Pennsylvania. But we were proactive rather than being reactive, because we've never, and you know, our clergy are doing so much just trying to be pastoral. I didn't want to put that burden on them. They would have to develop their individual protocols. And I'll brag, I think we have the best protocols for any church in the Episcopal Church in the entire, it's amazing what we have.
I will let you brag, because there was a newspaper write-up of what you did, and it certainly seems to be a model that can be used moving forward. As we transition, I see that Dr. Francis Collins has joined us from NIH, and we want to turn to him. But do either of you very quickly have any words of wisdom for churches that are looking to begin to be more actively involved in vaccine distribution?
Well, I think the one thing that I would say is that we have to collaborate. We can work on what Bishop Gutierrez has already done. We don't have to start from scratch. The wheels are already there. There's so much information. And so community engagement is best, I think, when we build off of the efforts that others have and we're willing to work together to make a difference in the lives of our church families and communities.
I would just add is, don't assume that when you say people are going to wear a mask, or that they say they're done this, that it's actually that you are protected. You know, you just have to verify, and you pray, you verify, and that sometimes you just have to just draw the line. We've never encountered this, and I'd rather have high banks to channel the river than overflowing the banks and nothing survives.
Amen.
Amen. Great way to segue. Thank you both. We now have joining us Dr. Francis Collins, who is the director of the National Institutes of Health. We appreciate so much you making this time to be with us. We know that all of our panelists' schedules are really, really busy. And so we are grateful for you taking this time to join us. We want to, there's a question that I want to ask, and also, well, 2 questions really to help segue us into talking a little bit more about what it means to stay safe, and even thinking about access to the vaccines and how faith groups can be involved. We know that NIH has some resources available for underserved populations to get access to the vaccine. If you could just talk a little bit about that, it would be great to hear from you what those resources are.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Copeland-Toon, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to be part of this program for the National Council of Churches. Yes, I am the director of the National Institutes of Health, but I'm also a person of faith, and I think if there was ever a time for science and faith to get together and try to see what we can do to prevent suffering and to save lives and to wrestle this terribly difficult pandemic into submission, which I believe we can do together. This is it. So really happy to have a chance to say a few things, but I'm sorry that I couldn't hear the conversation before this. I don't hope I will not be overly duplicative of things that people have already put forward. Yes, we do at NIH have deep concerns about access to vaccines, about health equity, about the hesitancy, which if it is not dealt with effectively may leave people at risk who don't need to be and may also prevent us from reaching this wonderful blanket of population immunity, which is sometimes called herd immunity, although I don't much care for the term. Makes us sound like we're all a bunch of cattle, which we are not. But we do have the promise now with the just amazing scientific progress that was possible over 2020 to have no less than 3 vaccines in the United States that FDA in a very rigorous public evaluation has declared safe and effective. And that data is very compelling, but of course, it's also countered by lots of concerns that people have coming from other directions and a lot of uncertainty about who do you trust. And I've been around long enough to know that if you are seeking to ask people to trust in something, it's the voices of trustworthy speakers that are going to make the most difference. And for a community or an individual who is hesitant about vaccination, to hear from an old white guy who works for the federal government just might not be that exciting compared to hearing from their doctor, who's part of their community, their pastor, who's part of their community, their elected representative, their community organizer, people that they know, who they know are not bringing some kind of special conflict of interest to the table, but who really have their best interests at heart. So we really have been trying to see what we could do at NIH, recognizing that we are a research organization. We're not about healthcare delivery, but we do figure out ways to utilize our resources to try to achieve better delivery to health communities that oftentimes are underserved. So we have a whole program called SEAL, the Community Engagement Alliance, which is set up specifically to reach out to underserved communities. Initially, it was about trying to see whether there was a way to do a better job of interesting those communities in research in those vaccine trials, because if people were going to believe that these vaccines were good for them, they'd want to look at the trials and say, were there people like me in these trials or not? And that was actually quite successful. If you look at the Moderna trial, for instance, 37% of those 30,000 participants were people of color. So people can look at that data and say, yeah, that did include my own group, whatever group you're from. And I think that was really important. Beyond that, though, SEAL has also stepped up to try to see, could we do a better job of making testing available to underserved communities? Because we still need testing and it's not so accessible in a lot of places. And if you want to give people the chance to reduce transmission by finding out that they are actually somebody who should stay away from a little bit from interactions because they're infected, you have to provide the kind of testing that gives you an answer right away, not something that's going to take 3 days to come back and is a big pain to set up. So we've been working through that and I think making some headway. But now a lot of this is now focused on the issue of vaccine hesitancy, and SEAL now has 11 states where basically we are putting resources in the hands of the community leaders saying, we think you're in a better position to know how to get this message out than maybe we are in Washington, D.C. And I think that is making some progress. There are a lot of public health, public service messages that are getting rolled out this week and next week. And I hope that will also be of help. They've been pretty well thought through and pretty well designed. But again, there's no substitute for the credible voices being willing to step up. And this is why I am so pleased that churches are seeing this as part of their mission as well. You as church leaders do have a special opportunity to speak to people in a way that they respect and will listen to and will recognize that you have their best interests at heart. And so having churches willing to both send those messages out from whatever virtual pulpit you happen to be in, and unfortunately they're mostly virtual right now, but also to set up in your own fellowship halls or other physical spaces opportunity for immunization to take place, I just think is a wonderful step forward. It fills in an enormous void that otherwise is just not being offered to people who have been hit really hard with COVID-19, and yet for whom the access to vaccines has not been as broad as it should be. So really thank you, all of you who are listening, for the steps you are taking in that regard, and glad to do whatever I can to help from my perch as the director of NIH, as well as a person of faith.
That was one of the reasons we were hopeful that you would be able to participate. You have such a broad lens, and I love the idea of faith and science kind of meeting and being together on this. I think is so critical and important. One question that was in the chat that I'm not sure if Dr. Collins, if you have a sense of this. Dr. Smith from CDC is still on with us. And I know he has to jump off soon. He may want to hop in on this particular question. And then we have another doctor, Dr. Miriam Burnett, who has joined us, who is not only a pastor and a medical doctor, but she heads the Commission for Health for the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The question that was in the chat that we want to try to ask about the vaccines is, do we know how long they last? I don't know if there's an answer to that question. If either of you can help us, that would be answer that. That would be great, or give us some parameters or ideas of what we might look to in that regard.
And that's a very good question. A lot of people are asking that. And we don't have a really clear answer, since we've only known about this particular virus for about 14 months, and the vaccines have only been administered, even in the trials, since about last July. We know they look pretty good for many months, but is this the sort of thing where you might need a booster a year later or 2 years later? Or is this the sort of thing that will have a longer lasting effect? There's sort of two things to think about there. One is, does the immunity to the original virus last a long time? Will it be like measles, where, once you've had that measles virus vaccine, you don't need to have it again, it's lifetime? Or will this be more like the flu, where things kind of wear off after a bit? And part of that is also these new variants that we are watching closely, which have emerged in various parts of the world, including in the US now, in California and in New York, and which have a slightly different shape to the surface of the virus. That means the vaccine may have a little bit less ability to fight it off. So far, we're in pretty good shape here. None of the variants that have been well described and that are getting to be frequent appear to be a problem for our current vaccines, but we got to watch that closely. And if something down the line gets even further away from the virus we started with, it might require then a booster, not of exactly the same vaccine, but an upgrade based on what we can see happening. Kind of a long answer, but I think at the moment we could say, get the vaccine as soon as it's offered to you. It will provide you with protection for some time, but we don't actually know what that long time limit looks like. And it'll take a while to find out, because we've never dealt with this virus until this particular period of time.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Dr. Smith, I know you have to jump off shortly. I want to just ask if you wanted to add anything else to that before you hop off.
Yes, please.
Dr. Collins covered that very, very well. Again, since these vaccines are relatively new, we'll learn more as time goes on, and we'll find out whether we need to give boosters or whether the vaccine will be just fine for longer periods of time. So stay tuned on that one. Thank you.
Yes. Well said.
Dr. Burnett, we'll talk to you momentarily, but I don't know if you wanted to jump in specifically for that question.
That was both of those questions. Those answers were fine as far as I'm concerned. So thank you.
Okay, great. We're moving along.
Yeah, it's just an honor to be on the platform with these two wonderful gentlemen who are providing great leadership for us.
Well, the feeling's mutual, Dr. Burnett. Wonderful to be on a platform with you.
And Leslie, I just wanted to add that the toolkits that are available on the CDC and NIH websites, many of these questions are answered in those toolkits, and they've made them so that you can brand it for your own church or community, so it's information that can be trusted. And I think that's been a valuable gift to our communities, to know that we have the data. We don't have to start from scratch. These frequently asked questions, and they're updating it rather frequently. And
Yes.
there are several that are targeted to the faith community, the Hispanic faith community, the Black Hispanic faith community, so that we can meet people where they are. So I want to thank both of them for making sure that that kind of work continues, and for sharing with us today. That it really does help us.
Thank you. And yeah, and again, the CDC is probably the most reliable, most thorough, most comprehensive place to go and find answers. But we have quite a lot of information at NIH. And then there are other organizations also that post valuable, reliable, evidence-based information. Just don't go to the social media and count on that to be what you need.
Unless you're going to the AME social media, which takes pieces from NIH and CDC and
Right.
Other infectious disease entities to make sure it's comprehensive. Readily available information, because people may not drill down to NIH and CDC, but if we can give them snippets with the links, which is what we do, it provides them, oh, I may want to look at this some more. We use all of the infographics. They're all readily available, because we want, just like Dr. Gerton Mitchell says, is to be able to say, we believe this, so take it and run.
That's
Great
great.
point.
Yeah. So one of the questions that was asked in the chat is about people who have compromised immune systems with the vaccine, such as cancer. So I want to throw that question out for a response, and then also to shift back a little bit to houses of worship being effective as vaccine sites, vaccine distribution sites. So, but first, if we could just sort of try to answer that question, because I do know that that has been heavy on the hearts of people. We hear it a lot. What if you are, your immune system is compromised through cancer or some other ailment? What should their expectations be, and what words of wisdom do you have for them?
Well, I can quickly start, but others may want to jump in. Again, this is a very important question, and there are research studies underway right now to see what's the responsiveness of people with immune suppression to the current vaccines. One thing I would say is there is no concern with this vaccine that somehow the vaccine itself might give you COVID-19. This is not a killed virus. It's not an inactivated virus. It's not a virus that's been made less infectious or less dangerous. It's not a virus at all. It is basically a way of getting the immune system to respond to that spike protein that's on the surface of the virus. But the virus itself is not in the vaccine. So there is no risk that somehow an immunocompromised person might actually get sick with COVID-19 from the vaccine. The real question is, will their immune system mount an effective response? And that is going to depend a lot on just what kind of immune compromise this person has. If they've had chemotherapy, how far down has the immune system been knocked by that? So you would want to be careful and not assume that the effectiveness is going to be 95% the way it is in somebody with a normal immune system, but there's no danger. So I would say people who are immunocompromised clearly ought to talk to your doc and consider taking the vaccine, but then be careful afterwards not to assume that it's had the same completely protective effect as it would if your immune system was fully functional.
In addition to that, I have been telling patients as well as those of all that I speak with and address that one of the things they need to consider is they must speak with their primary care physician. And if they don't have one, to get one.
Yes.
And so one of the things that we've been asking our churches to do is to assist people who have not tapped into a primary care physician to do so that they can hold those kinds of specific conversations. Is there someone who is immunocompromised because of their fear of going into a medical facility, not done so in the past year? And then to encourage them to just do just that, because those cases are mounting. And we've got people who are in worse shape than they were last year because they have avoided the medical facilities.
That's a great point.
So one of the other question that has come up is how houses of worship can make themselves available to be vaccine sites. Who should they call? Should they call, NIH?
FEMA is accumulating a list of houses of worship that wish to participate. There is certain information that they are requesting and requiring. I actually sent one to put it on Facebook in every place I could think of putting it, not just directed at the AME Church, but directed at anybody that wanted to participate and offer their house of worship. Because the key things that they ask are, what does your space look like? How fast can you turn it around? What's the size? And as well as who's the person in charge? Who do we contact when we say, yes, we want to be in that zip code? And so it is accessible. I can put the link in we're using a SurveyMonkey tool, and every few days I download it and send it back to my contact at FEMA, and I'd be glad to share it here in this arena as well. I do have to look for it, so after I finish speaking, then I'll do that.
That would be great. And yeah, some people have also tried reaching out to their state health department. Sometimes they can help you, but FEMA is probably your first place to go. So thank you, Dr. Burnett.
I hadn't thought of FEMA, so that's really helpful. And Dr. Collins, is there anything else? I feel like there's so much to ask, and you have such a breadth of information. What have we not asked, or what should we be thinking about as we help both faith communities and others, family members, others in our communities to negotiate getting the vaccine, knowing where and how to go about that, and any other information or wisdom you can share with us? We'd appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think a big part of the challenge is to be sure that access is made available, and what you all are doing and what we were just talking about in terms of having houses of worship step into that space is going to make such a difference. But I think we also have to recognize that there are still a lot of people who are hesitant. Even if vaccination was readily available to them, there are some folks who go, I'm just not sure about this. And one of the things I've learned about vaccine hesitancy is that every person who has hesitancy has it for a little different reason than somebody else does. And it doesn't work to assume that we know immediately why somebody is resistant. You really need to listen. So I've been trying to do a lot of listening. My wife says that's a nice thing for me to try to pick up on. So basically, there are hesitancies that come from concerns about safety. Do we really know that this is going to be safe when we've only had the vaccines for a few months? And in that regard, we can say with every other vaccine, if there was going to be a safety risk, it appears in the first couple of months, and we have not seen that. So that's really reassuring. There are people who are concerned because of the story that there was fetal cells somehow used in these vaccines. And I can be very reassuring. The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines were not produced using fetal cell lines at all. The J&J vaccine is grown in a cell line that was derived in 1985 from an elective pregnancy termination in Scandinavia, but that cell line's been carried in the lab ever since. There are certainly no fetal cells right now in any of these materials, and the Catholic Church has looked at this closely and considered that it's entirely appropriate for pro-life believers to use the vaccine anyway, because it is a life-saving opportunity. So that also is something worth talking about. And then people will have heard other kinds of stories. Maybe it causes infertility. No, that is not the case. We have absolutely no evidence for that. Maybe it is something that will have a chip in it that's going to follow you around because Bill Gates wants to know what you're doing. I've talked to Bill Gates, and he's actually pretty involved in this whole thing and isn't that interested in what people are doing, actually. But yeah, those things do get into people's heads, and they really start to wonder, wait a minute, is this some kind of a conspiracy to track us all around? It is not. This is really an effort to try to help people. And then for believers, I think there is also, and I get this sense of, well, God will take care of me. I pray every day. I do. I open my Bible at 5 a.m. every morning, and I look for those promises, and I read the Psalms a lot this year, particularly in the face of the lament that we are all feeling from the terrible suffering and devastation that has happened. But do people think to themselves, well, if I'm going to trust in God, does it mean that if I get a vaccine that I didn't really quite trust in God? And here's where I think it does help for leaders of the church to point out that trusting in God doesn't mean you might not also trust in something that God has made possible through medicine, that those are actually trusts that go together. They're not in conflict. And certainly for me as a scientist who sees science as a way of understanding God's creation and getting a glimpse of God's mind and being able to use the tools of science to help people, to commit to healing people in ways that they need. And that seems to me like that's very consistent with everything I know that Christianity stands for. So reassuring people that in no way does rolling up your sleeve mean that you weren't really serious when you were on your knees the night before. You can do both of these things, and they both are an honor to your faith.
Amen. Amen. That is an excellent framing. If we were in church, I would shout and say some other things, but we're not. So I know you have to go, and we're going to segue into just talking a little bit about resources through the American Rescue Plan. There's a question that I think either you, Dr. Collins, or Dr. Burnett can answer. Someone has put in the chat, how long does the shot, the upper arm, is they still are having some soreness in their upper arm? So if they're having side effects, a few weeks, this happened, they got their shot. This is Linda Rivers on February 16th, and she still has some soreness. So what kind of expectations can you share with us should someone have if they're still having some soreness or other side effect they feel like is from the vaccine shot?
Yeah, that would be unusual. Certainly having a sore arm for 2 or 3 days or maybe even a week is not unheard of. And certainly people have had other more systemic symptoms like headache or chills or feeling fatigued. I did after my second Moderna shot. I was not doing all that well for 24 hours, but I was glad because it said, this is working. My immune system is responding. And 36 hours later, I was fine. So yeah, this side effects, and maybe we shouldn't call them side effects, the effects of the vaccine can be noticeable, but they shouldn't go on more than 24, 36 hours. And certainly for somebody who still has a sore arm weeks later, that would be an occasion to go and find out if something else is going on. It would be hard for me to understand how the shot itself did that.
2 things I would say. One is there is a reporting system, and I will drop the link for that into the chat. And anything that goes beyond a week or so, as Dr. Collins had said, I would suggest calling the primary care physician or going to an urgent care center sooner rather than later.
I agree.
helpful. Quickly, and we'll move to Lily Roberts from Center for American Progress, who's joined us. Do either of you think we will begin to carry around our CDC vaccinations with us? Will that become part of the new normal?
I don't know, Dr. Burnett, what do you think? Are we going to need a passport?
I'm thinking we might need one to go to do international travel.
Mhm. That's where it's being talked about.
Yeah. It's not being necessarily talked about state to state, but I think international travel, it's a possibility. Just like yellow fever, you know,
Yeah.
when we get our yellow fever vaccines, you got the yellow card.
Oh, yeah.
A matter of fact, when I got my Moderna vaccine, I had it added to my yellow card because I know what's coming. I just think my gut tells me it's coming.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
Might be
Thank you
right.
both
Makes sense.
so much. I think Dr. Burnett is staying with us. Dr. Collins, I know you may have to jump off soon. We appreciate so much both of your times and helping us to just delve deeper into this. This has been fantastic.
I'm glad to help in any way I can. Just let me know. And thank you all for what you're doing to get the word out here. We're going to get through this with God's help.
I can be with you all until 2:30.
Okay. All right. Wonderful.
One of the things I wanted to follow up with Dr. Gerton Mitchell is the AME Church has a reopen document with a checklist that we created back in March of last year, the first week of March of last year. Bishop, I think that between the two of our documents, they are extremely comprehensive, and I would recommend to anyone that they take them side by side, whatever is missing, add them together. And Bishop, maybe we want to do that together.
That sounds great. And we will make them available on NCC's website.
I would love it. As my sister from the AME, it was Richard Allen and Absalom Jones who
That's right.
dealt with the pandemic when Thomas Jefferson and the rest of them ran out of Philly. So we have a history.
And I am in Philly.
Oh, okay. Let's do it.
So great. This is what this is all about, collaboration. I want to go quickly to Lily Roberts. She has a hard stop as well. It may seem a little strange to add in the American Rescue Plan, but we were hoping to just get resources that are available out here for our consideration so that we would all be more informed at the end of this webinar than we were in the beginning. So we thank you, Lily, so much for joining us. Lily is a wealth of knowledge on this subject and is going to give us just a brief overview of what is available and what we should look for in the American Rescue Plan.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here with everybody today. My name is Lily Roberts. I'm the Managing Director of Economic Policy at the Center for American Progress, which is a think tank here in DC. It's my job to keep track of whatever Congress is doing or not doing at any given time. And so I wanted to come today to give you a really quick overview of some of the economic resources. You've heard a lot about the health resources that are being made available and particularly the vaccine rollout, but wanted to talk a little bit about the economic aid that's been going out to communities in the last couple of weeks because, obviously the pandemic sort of takes the spotlight here, but we know that this past year has also been a year of economic devastation for people. And there are quite a few avenues for financial resources for different communities that I wanted to make sure that you all are aware of, both sort of for your own organizations and then in also sort of getting the word out for your congregations or your communities. I'm going to share my slides, I hope. Okay, I think I'm doing this. It's always fun to figure out a new Zoom platform. Okay, so I'm hoping that you'll be able to see my slides. It should say what's in 1.9 trillion on your slide here. The American Rescue Plan, which is the package of legislation that was just passed through Congress and signed by President Biden 2 weeks ago now, cost $1.9 trillion That's a huge amount of money, and it's on top of about $3 trillion that we've already had over the course of the past year. So everything from those unemployment insurance extensions to funding specifically for the vaccines, sorry, I'm trying to minimize my little, there we go. Funding for vaccines, funding for the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses and nonprofits, which tried to keep people sort of on payroll, sort of all of the aid that's gone into trying to minimize the economic effects of the pandemic. So $1.9 trillion is a huge amount of money. It's a really hard amount of money to keep track of and to sort of understand what it's going to look like in communities. So I wanted to show this graph because I think it does a nice job of sort of giving you a sense of where it's going. One of the big headlines of the ARP has been the $1,400 checks. Those are going out to families, members of communities. Many of them have already hit people's bank accounts. But then there are other sort of direct aid to people as well. So there's aid that went to states and municipalities intended to prevent states from having to lay off workers. There's another round of extending unemployment insurance benefits. There are tax credits for families. And then there are all of these little small slices of the pie on the right side of the screen that support different groups of people and different sectors of the economy that have sort of had particular downturns or troubles this past year. Probably the most salient slices of those pies for people is the sort of money to people bracket. So $1,400 checks, which I mentioned, which importantly in this round includes adult dependents like the elderly and relatives with disabilities who might live with their family members, college students, 17-year-olds. We also have an extension to unemployment benefits. So people who have been unemployed for a full year because maybe they work in a restaurant or a hospitality industry, and those industries are still have way fewer jobs than they had in February of last year. And those people now still have continued access to unemployment benefits, whereas in a normal economic period, those would have expired by now. There are a couple that I think are less publicized that are hugely impactful if they actually reach the people they're meant to reach. So I want to focus on those in particular. The American Rescue Plan includes a huge increase to the child tax credit. It removes the earnings phase-in, which means that people making $0 in income can now access this tax credit. It raises the amount of money that people can receive in the tax credit. So it's up to $3,000 for kids aged 6 to 17, and also gives a premium for young children because we know that young children are more expensive to raise than older children. So $3,600 for kids under 6. It also, one interesting thing that's going to probably start this summer is usually if you get your tax credit, if you get your EITC refund or other refunds for your tax payment every year, you might get that in February or March when you file your taxes. This tax credit is now going to change to be paid out periodically. So the IRS is working it out right now. It might be twice a year, it might be 4 times a year, but you would get a portion of your refund several times a year instead of one lump sum. There are a lot of studies that show that that's way better for families and could make a huge difference financially for families. The earned income tax credit for workers without kids at home has also expanded dramatically. This is really important for seniors in particular. It used to be that the EITC you couldn't access it if you were over the age of 64. We know that there are a lot of people over 64 who do still work, and this change to the EITC eliminates that pretty nonsensical age limit of 64-year-olds. It also dramatically increases the benefits that people will receive under the EITC. There's also a change to the child and dependent care tax credit, so that we have the child tax credit and then we also have the child care tax credit, which is going to be for both low and middle income families, with a really big increase in the amount that folks will receive as a tax credit covering their childcare expenses. And then finally, there's this reduction in healthcare premiums. So people who lose their jobs will now have COBRA subsidized. So it'll cover the entire cost of COBRA premiums for people who lose their jobs, and then also boosts the premium assistance for 12 million people who get their health insurance through the marketplace. So the takeaway here is that if implemented correctly, the American Rescue Plan could cut child poverty in half this year. That would be a huge, huge policy victory. It shows, how close that was to our fingertips this whole time. All it takes is a couple of dramatic increases to child tax credits and some $1,400 checks, and we can cut child poverty in half. The downside is that we're really worried about the implementation here. We're worried that people won't know that they have access to these tax credits, and they might have trouble getting the $1,400 checks to their bank account, all kinds of things that community organizations and churches could be really helpful in sort of raising awareness for. There are a couple other buckets of big pots of money that are in this bill, but I also wanted to highlight sort of the social programming aid. Many of your congregations may be involved in causes or providing services to your communities. So just wanted to feature sort of the housing assistance. There's dramatic food assistance. There's a huge amount of childcare intended to both cover sort of childcare providers as well as providing more subsidized care for people who need to use childcare. And then there's also a continued unemployment insurance expansion. So you may have employees in your congregations who are sort of contractors or W-2 employees. I'm a former gig singer at a church, and I got a bunch of W-2s. Those people are now actually eligible for unemployment insurance. So making sure that you're doing your due diligence in working with, I'm assuming you may not be hiring as many singers as you might be in normal times. Those people, if they have fewer gigs these days, may be eligible to receive unemployment insurance. So I sort of highlighted these big, great sort of headline numbers, billions and billions of dollars to support families who need it the most. But the IRS, which is tasked with administering a lot of this, has been totally gutted staff-wise and funding-wise for decades. And now they have to administer billions in checks and tax refunds right before the filing deadline, although the filing deadline has been extended until May. Millions of people might not be aware that they're eligible. And then there's also this interesting component of the bill, $350 billion for cities and states. They'll get significant funding, but they may default to plugging budget holes instead of spending money on the communities that need support the most. So I think there's a bit of an advocacy opportunity in your communities to make sure that you're talking with your city and state about how they're going to spend this money they're getting from the federal government and how to ensure that that goes to the people who really need it the most. And a little flavor of sort of what comes next. There's going to be more federal spending, and there's going to be a huge undertaking to make the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit changes permanent. So if you're seeing those be implemented in your community, working with your local or your members of the Senate to make sure that you're sort of lifting up the stories of how those are impacting people's lives will be really crucial. And that is the end of my slideshow. I told Reverend Leslie that I had to leave at 2:25, but I can actually stay until 2:35. So really happy to field any questions that I can. I know that's a lot of detail about big numbers, but wanted to sort of drive home the point that it's a huge pot of money, but it really should show up in people's communities pretty quickly. We're actually seeing that already. So this week, if you want to be really cool, you can track the weekly release of census surveys, which ask people about their financial circumstances week to week. This week's was released just before this call, and I was going through the data. And the best news I have read in months was in there. The number of families behind on rent dropped by 1.2 million families in the last 2 weeks. That's a huge victory. And it's really wonderful to think about how quickly that money is getting to the people who need it the most. It's not going to solve all of the problems. People are still dealing with really awful circumstances and have been unemployed or underemployed for a year, but there is some hope that some of this money will start to show up in communities pretty quickly.
Thank you. That was really helpful. There was a question in the chat wondering if the food assistance category will help food pantries sponsored by churches or other agencies.
So there are two streams of money. I'm not an expert on food assistance, but I do know that there are sort of two streams of money that might be useful. So I'm going through my little slides so I make sure that I have the right info. So one thing that you should definitely be aware of for sort of tying into your community or your state network of food assistance providers is that this money does one interesting thing that they've done is they've expanded allowing states to use the pandemic EBT, which is in most cases, most kids get meals at school. Obviously, if they're not in school in person, that presents a really big problem. So the pandemic EBT program changes that to sort of traditional EBT benefits like a grocery card. They've also, I know, linked up with a lot of community programs to fund community programs directly to provide meals because the kids aren't receiving them in schools. So if you're not already connected with your state's pandemic EBT, you should reach out to them to figure out how those benefits could be best used to get people aware of your food providing. I will also say that that's also been extended to throughout the summer. So usually that's just a school year program. And very importantly, they realized like kids are going to need food this summer and they won't have their traditional relationships with their school providers. So they've extended pandemic EBT throughout the summer. There's also additional funding through state and local funding. So that $350 billion that I mentioned, it's pretty much up to the states and municipalities' discretion of how to use that money. If there is a significant food assistance need in the community, many states and cities are looking at that as a place to fund sort of additional aid to folks. So I would say that be on the lookout for how your state and city are using their slice of the $350 billion. And that's separate money. So your state will get some money, and then on top of that, cities, counties, municipalities will get money as well.
Great. And there's a question, and I'm about Medicaid expansion. Can you just quickly let us know how that's working within the American Rescue Plan?
Sure. So there are incentives for Medicaid expansion at the state level. It's up to the states to determine how they expand Medicaid, but there is federal funding for like incentivizing states to do that. There's also additional healthcare funding in the bill. There's sort of like funding for vaccines and healthcare provision. There's also changes to healthcare coverage within the bill that I mentioned, I think the COBRA expansion, as well as the coverage of premiums for people who receive marketplace insurance. In some states that have not expanded Medicaid, those people who in other states would receive Medicaid may be purchasing insurance on the marketplace. Those people should be receiving pretty significant premium coverage under the new law.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. Oh,
Sure.
did you want to?
I just remembered something that I had wanted to add. I apologize. So one thing that I really wanted to focus on in terms, I mentioned a couple times that I'm really worried about sort of outreach and people being aware that they are now eligible for additional tax credits. People who might not otherwise file taxes because they don't have much income at all may actually be positioned to receive tax credits. So they would basically be making money by filing their taxes, but many people, obviously, that's a really silly way to set up a system. So many people aren't aware of that. I really want to encourage congregations and community organizations to work with their local VITA and free tax filer services. Many churches host VITA sites, and that's crucial in reaching out to communities. So just wanted to sort of plug that. people making up to it varies by state, but most low income and even many middle income people should never have to pay to file their taxes. And the best advice you can get about your eligibility for different tax credits will be found by someone who's had some training in filing their taxes. So at a VITA site, you're likely to get really good information about what members of the congregation would be eligible for and what they should be on the lookout for. So just definitely encourage folks to reach out to their community of really wonderful tax preparers who work through VITA sites.
Okay, yeah. And people can apply for COBRA where? That was a question. COBRA assistance. Do you have a sense of that?
There should be a wide range of ways that you can access more information about COBRA eligible and particularly about sort of getting your premiums covered when you've lost a job. So most of the time going through your state unemployment insurance system, they'll be able to connect people with information about COBRA. Unemployment insurance is a state by state system. So we have 53 different unemployment insurance systems in this country, but they should be able to do a good job of connecting folks to other benefits, including COBRA, but sometimes SNAP or housing assistance or other things that they may become eligible for if they've lost their job.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Lily. This has been
course.
great. I think it gave a really broad view and helpful information about what the American Rescue Plan will help us. While the vaccines will help us get out of the health crisis, the American Rescue Plan will help us get out of the economic crisis. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So we are now going to turn to hear from Dr. Lena Nguyen, who some of you may have seen on CNN. She's a medical expert for CNN. She also is a professor at George Washington University Medical School and she has been an ER doctor as well. She wasn't able to join us live, so we talked to her earlier on Monday, actually, and she gives some really great information and tips about staying safe. There's a question in the chat about social distancing and some of wearing masks and some of those kinds of questions. We are going to hear from her. She does answer those questions. And then I hope you will stay with us because we'll have a very powerful session from two very powerful ministers and mental health professionals who will be on next to talk about some of while there's an economic crisis, there's a health crisis, there's also a mental health crisis that we're seeing and have been experiencing. And so they'll give us some guidance and offer some help for all of us as we help to negotiate this pandemic and the stress, anxiety, and grief we've all had, and that we see others are experiencing as well. So Keith, if you could start just the words from Dr. Nguyen about staying safe while we're waiting to get vaccinated. I wanted to just open up and begin by asking you, where are we with the pandemic and what should we know?
Well, first of all, Reverend, it's a real delight to be with you today. And thank you all for the work that you all do as we proceed in the pandemic and just in general. I mean, I think that your voice as leaders in the community, you are absolutely essential in helping us to save lives in this pandemic. And so thank you for the work that you're doing every day. In terms of where we are, I would say that we are at a crossroads because on the one hand, we have seen terrible surges in the past. We have seen a decline from the holiday surge, and we're now at a much better place than we were a couple of months ago. But on the other hand, we're still seeing more than 50,000 new infections every day, more than 1,000 deaths every day. That can never become normal to us as we go on in this pandemic. But also, we don't know exactly what's going to happen next. As in, on the one hand, we are getting vaccinations really ramped up, thanks to the great work of the federal government and local and state governments and private entities and all of you. We are now at between 2 and 3 million vaccinations in the US every day, which is really phenomenal news. But on the other hand, we also have the arrival of more contagious variants that really threaten whatever progress that we've made. And so I talk about this fork in the road because where we go from here really depends on the actions that we take today. So if we continue to increase our vaccinations, but continue to be on our guard, I really think that we are in for a much better spring and summer, and we could potentially reach herd immunity, enough vaccination that we could end this pandemic in 2021. On the other hand, we could let these more contagious variants take over. We could plateau at a very high level of infection, continue to see 1,000 deaths per day, and be facing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more deaths from COVID-19, which is an unbearable tragedy. So as it has been during the entire pandemic, where we go from here is up to us.
Yeah, thank you for that. You have talked on your social media about harm reduction, and I've also heard you mention this on CNN and other places. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by harm reduction?
Yeah, so I am a professor of public health. I also previously worked in the city of Baltimore as the health commissioner for my city. And there is a concept in public health of harm reduction. And we know this concept initially through the work around drug addiction. Of course, we may wish that somebody isn't addicted to drugs. However, if they are, we know that needle exchange, as an example, will reduce their risk of transmitting HIV and hepatitis to others. And in the same vein, when I was in Baltimore, we had an initiative on getting naloxone or Narcan, the opioid antidote, to every single resident in our city, because we believe that if somebody is dying from overdose now, if we don't save their lives right now, we're not going to be able to get them a better life tomorrow. So this idea of harm reduction is, you may not approve of whatever practice is going on, but knowing that it's happening anyway, how can we try to reduce risk as much as possible? So when this applies to coronavirus, we know that right now, not everyone is abiding by public health guidelines. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, for example, currently is saying that people should not be engaging in non-essential travel. However, the TSA is reporting that air traffic is higher, or traffic through airports is higher than it has been during the entire pandemic over the last 10 days, that it's higher even during the Christmas and Thanksgiving surge periods. So we know that people are not abiding by what we're asking them to do. Look at the pictures of people on spring break. Clearly, they're not following the guidelines to practice physical distancing and masking. Now, of course, we want people to be doing this, but if we know that they're not, harm reduction is about reducing their likelihood of risk to themselves. And because we're dealing with a very contagious illness, the risk to others as well. And so a harm reduction practice might be to say, okay, you've gone on spring break. I wish you didn't go. But now that you have gone, when you come back, you should quarantine for 5 days or 7 days and then get tested so that you don't end up spreading the infection in your community. Also, harm reduction would be to say, okay, I know you want to travel across the country to see your loved ones and be in this wedding. Please wait until after you're vaccinated, because the vaccine is a major harm reduction practice. Wearing masks, another key element of harm reduction that protects you from others and others from you. And I hope it's that kind of practice that we engage in. And I think just another note about this, because I know we'll be speaking a lot about vaccines, I see harm reduction too as a compassionate method of approaching people, because I think so often in this country, unfortunately, we have been politicizing elements of the coronavirus response. And we are therefore prone to see someone who has reluctance, let's say, about vaccines. We label them in one category. And we say, maybe there's an immediate a sense of there's something wrong with this person, right? That they're anti-science, they're not listening to public health experts, what's wrong with them? But actually, I think we should approach people with compassion and empathy and listening and understanding where people are coming from, which I know is the work that all of you as clergy do every day.
That's true. I will have to confess that this morning, as I saw a video from the spring breaks, I was screaming at the TV, why are you doing this? It was hard to watch, honestly, knowing everything that we do know. It was very difficult to watch some of the footage from over the weekend and seeing people not taking it seriously.
I know, and I will just say that for us as clinicians, I'm an ER doc as well, and for those of us working in the emergency departments, seeing what our patients are going through and the suffering of their families. And I mean, I don't know how many of my colleagues in this last year have done something that we never would have thought imaginable, which is to hold up a phone to our patient as their family members say goodbye to them. I mean, that's just something that we never really thought was the norm in practicing medicine, but that's happened. So we would go from the ER, walk out the doors, and see people without masks partying. I will say that cognitive dissonance is really difficult. So I understand the difficulty of approaching people with this level of listening and compassion, but I think it's really important.
One of the things that you mentioned was some of and I appreciate you're kind of going over some of the safety measures that people should take in harm reduction. There's been some discussion about whether people should be 3 feet apart or 6 feet apart or as much as 13 feet apart. Can you just sort of clear that up for us? And one of the big questions that we often get is, when can we go back to church, really? Or when can we go back to worship or larger gatherings? And I don't know if you have any guidance or wisdom that you can share with us about that.
Yeah, I'll address the distancing question first, which is that there is no magic number, right? It's not as if at 5 feet, you're definitely going to get coronavirus, but at 7 feet, you're totally safe. I mean, the 6 feet is a rule of thumb. And so I think that's one way of thinking about it. The greater the distance, the better. And also wearing a mask makes a difference. In addition, being outdoors versus indoors makes a huge difference. Actually, studies have shown that being outdoors versus indoors reduces your likelihood of transmission by 18 to 19 times. So a major difference by being outdoors, because we know that this is a virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. This is a virus that is transmitted through the respiratory route, through large droplets, such as when you're coughing and sneezing, and also through aerosols. Tiny microscopic droplets that you exhale just by breathing or speaking or singing. And so this is why I would say outdoors, 6 feet apart, you're almost certainly to be very safe. Indoors, it depends on whether you're wearing a mask. I think if everyone is wearing a mask, 6 feet is fine. In schools with younger children, the CDC has said that 3 feet is fine, but that's for young children who are in school, totally wearing masks the whole time. Not the case for adults. So I would say adults, 6 feet indoors with masks, still safer. Probably 10 feet is going to be safer than 6 feet. And then also would impact what activities people are doing. If the room is not well ventilated, everybody is shouting and singing, 6 feet, even with masks on, probably still has some risk. But 10 feet is going to be safer, especially if people are not singing as loudly. So again, I would look at this not as, at this point, it's not to say everything is 100% dangerous or 100% safe, but rather as gradations of risk. And so that leads me to answer your second question, Reverend, about the question about when is it safe to go back to worship. And I think that again depends on people's tolerance of risk. And I think it's at this point that we should talk about not just is something safe, but is something essential, and how much value we put on that activity. We've been thinking a lot about this with regard to schools, that for many of our children, in particular children who are the most vulnerable, who are younger, in-person schooling is really essential. I think for many people, in-person church services, religious services are really essential as well. In which case the conversation moves from, is it something that's safe, to, is it essential? If it's essential, how can you make it as safe as possible? I would say encouraging people to be vaccinated is really important, because the vaccines that we have, they are nearly 100% effective at reducing severe disease, meaning that you are virtually protected from having severe enough illness that causes hospitalization or death. And I think for many people, once they're vaccinated, they would feel comfortable going back to church because this is such an essential activity. And if there is risk of still potentially getting infected, but they're not going to get that ill that they could be severely ill, I think a lot of people would choose that as an activity that they really want to resume. I would continue to make sure, though, that people are masked. Masks, we know, dramatically reduce the risk of transmitting the virus. If you have members of the congregation who are elderly with medical issues, again, I would think about, are there ways to make it safer for them? Are there services that you can continue to do outdoors? Can you do some services where there isn't loud singing? Make sure that there is a lot of space in between members of different households as much as possible to accommodate those who are the most vulnerable. But I would say in this case too, looking at values and risk is much better than just looking at just in general saying, is this safe or unsafe? Because there's no such thing as 100% safe or 100% unsafe. And I also think that this is one area where we should really be encouraging vaccination. If everyone or nearly everyone in your congregation is vaccinated, that really is key to returning back to normal.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And I think very common sense that people can grab hold of and embrace. Hopefully they can do that. I wonder, we will be talking about the vaccines throughout the webinar. Is there a word of advice or wisdom that you have about getting vaccinated? There may be up to 4 vaccines available soon. Right now there's 3 available. Any words that you have for those listening about taking the vaccine when it becomes available, or any words of wisdom as it relates to getting vaccinated?
Sure. Well, we have 3 vaccines that are authorized as of the time that we're talking, one from Pfizer and one from Moderna. These are the 2-dose vaccines. Then we have the one-dose vaccine from Johnson & Johnson. AstraZeneca may be submitting for authorization from the FDA, but that vaccine is probably not going to be available until May. And so for all intents and purposes, we're talking about the 2-dose Pfizer and Moderna or the 1-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I think the most important thing that I want to say about these vaccines is that they're all extremely effective at the endpoint that really matters, which is the endpoint of preventing severe illness. Then there are certain benefits of all these different types of vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a 1-dose vaccine, and I know that I have many patients who would prefer to have 1 dose and be one and done instead of scheduling another appointment, coming all the way back for that appointment to a testing site or to a vaccination site. And so I think the key is, I would really recommend for people to get the vaccine that you first have access to, recognizing that that is not going to be your last say on the vaccine. As in, it may well be that because of all the variants we have, that we're going to need a booster shot that specifically targets these variants. You may be able to get the booster shot from another company. It's not like if you commit to Pfizer or Moderna, that's the vaccine that you have to commit to for the rest of your life. I mean, think about all the flu vaccines that we get every year. I never ask, and I don't know if you do, ask, what is the manufacturer of that vaccine? We mix and match vaccines all the time. Now, don't get me wrong, if you get the Pfizer vaccine for the first shot, you should get Pfizer for your second shot, Moderna for the first shot, Moderna for the second shot. But after your initial vaccine, in the future, you may be able to get another vaccine. So get whatever vaccine comes your way first, because you want to get that level of immune protection into you as soon as possible.
That was so incredibly helpful. Thank you. I actually had that question and have been wondering, are you stuck with getting the same one for the second time? And so that was incredibly helpful. We thank you so much for your time. We will hope to figure out a way to have you back. You are just a wealth of knowledge. And this really, I think, clears up some of the main questions that we've been getting, at least about the vaccine, about staying safe, about wearing masks, and about potentially going back to worship. So thank you, Dr. Nguyen, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say thank you again to all of you for your wonderful work. There is an aphorism in public health about how it's not the message, but the messenger that really matters. And in this case, we know that our clergy, our pastors, our rabbis, our imams, all the people in the religious community, you are going to be the most credible messenger to so many people who look up to you, to so many millions of Americans. And so, as it has been during the entire pandemic, I really look to you to partner as we get out the word and improve public health. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And we look to you, and we're so glad you were able to join us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I hope that was helpful. It answered, she at least tried to answer the questions about singing and about when we could be at worship again together. And I think what, just to give it as a synopsis, is she's saying use wisdom and think about harm reduction as a way of deciding whether or not it is safe for your church to gather again, whether it's safe for singing, all of that, to really be thinking about all of the different factors that are involved with that, and how many people are vaccinated in your congregation and all of that. But of course, trying to get everybody in your congregations and houses of worship vaccinated as soon as possible, of course, would be the main thing. We want to move on to I think maybe, I don't know if it's the final crisis or the crisis that, the silent crisis, or how to really frame it, but we do know and are already seeing, many of you may be pastors or faith leaders in one aspect or another, that people are having a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of grief that is happening, collective grief, and we haven't been able to have the traditional funerals or rituals that we are accustomed to having. And so we wanted to just make sure that before we close out this webinar, that we really do talk a little bit about how to deal with the grief and anxiety and stress and the mental health and spiritual really issues that have come forward and come out of this pandemic. We have been in the house for a year. There's so many different issues that have been presented and are presenting themselves even now. Dr. Cheryl McMillan told me we're not going to have a crisis, we have a crisis already. And so many of our mental health professionals are already having an uptick in people who are coming to them, couples, families, individuals, and we want to really kind of delve into that. And to do that, we have two people who have been doing a lot of ministry work. They're both ministers, as I mentioned, and counselors, and will help us to delve into this a little bit and give us some guidance. So we have Reverend Dr. Demetra K.M. Hutchinson, who is a pastoral counselor and human resources and operations consultant. She's an ordained minister at Metropolitan Baptist Church and has a doctorate in human services counseling. And Reverend Dr. Jamie Frederica Edie, who is a pastoral theologian, a loss navigation specialist, and a death doula. You're the only person I've heard use that terminology, and I think it really speaks to the moment that we're in. She is also an associate minister at the historic St. Paul Baptist Church in Philadelphia. So thank you both so much for joining us. Dr. Demetra, I'll come to you first. I wonder, what can you say about the stress and anxiety? I was on a call earlier where somebody said, I'm so sick of Zoom calls. I want to scream. What can I like seeing you all, but I'm sick of seeing you all on Zoom. And there's other stresses and anxiety that is happening. What can you say? How should we navigate for ourselves and help others navigate in this space?
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I've learned so much, and so thrilled to be a part of this great seminar today. Stress is something we are all feeling today. This pandemic is something that, we never imagined. And so when you think about all that is going on, the Zoom calls and doing things in different ways that we haven't been accustomed to, you have to find different ways to address that stress. And one of the ways that I talk to my clients, family about is taking very good care of yourself. Self-care is critical during this time. We all have different levels of stress where some days it's maybe minimal, other days you're full on ready to scream, as the person presented the question saying, I am tired of Zoom calls. So yes, the stress is here, the stress is real. And first you need to give yourself permission to understand and know that it's okay. That it's okay not to be okay, but it's also okay to recognize when you're not okay, and work with some of the different tools that I can certainly recommend to help you through that stress. One of the things that I will say as it relates to Zoom calls, sometimes you have to give yourself a Zoom vacation. Sometimes you have to put some boundaries around your time and your space and being on Zoom. So for those Zoom calls that you have the ability to, determine whether you want to be on those calls or need to be on those calls, make those determinations. And when you need to take a break, take a break. So take a vacation from the Zoom calls, on calls that you don't have as much control over, perhaps calls for work, and that's how you communicate with your colleagues and with your management. Try to also limit your time to a certain amount of Zoom calls a day. So if your limit is 3 Zoom calls per day, then put that boundary in place, and as much as you can, have people to respect that is your boundary, and recognize that some days you may not have that leeway, but on the days that you do, you definitely want to take advantage of taking care of yourself. And that's one of the ways to take care of yourself. Outside of the Zoom calls and just dealing with the stress itself, one of the ways to deal with stress is, as I stated, to take care of self. Having a self-care routine is critical during this time. And self-care routine is a little bit different for everyone, but really tapping into yourself. For me, I pray, I meditate, I do something that doesn't require that I think. I love reading magazines. So figuring out what is it that I like to do that brings me joy. It doesn't have to be something extravagant. It doesn't have to be something big, but it needs to be something that you enjoy, that may take you away from the hustle and bustle of everything that you're having to deal with on a regular basis. Prayer gives me a peace, gives me a resolve, gives me the energy that I need to move forward with the things that I have to get done, but also listening to music, taking a walk. So figuring out what that is for you. Some people it's journaling. So there are many things that we can do to help us deal with the stressors that we are facing today. And the last thing I'll say in this regard, as it relates to stress and the anxiety that we're feeling, is that you need to make sure you're not isolating and moving into a space where you're isolating for days on end, where you're not engaging at all, because you can move into isolation and doing things in an isolated state, and that can be very dangerous as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Dr. Jamie, I know that you can certainly add to what Dr. Demetria has said. That was really helpful. I wonder, help us with the grief piece. I mean, there has been so much grief. I'm concentrated grief, and I'm not sure that we even recognize how much we're holding still. How do we negotiate and help others negotiate the grief of this season?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. I learned so much. I think first it's important that we acknowledge that the grief that we're carrying is not just grief from the loss of life, right? We already know that we are over half a million deaths related to COVID, but we've had other deaths as well. But our grief we are carrying from loss in general. And so we are carrying grief from the loss of contact from those that we love. I used to drive, I'm in Philadelphia now, so I'm sad I didn't get to talk to Bishop a bit, but I'm going to reach out later. I'm sad I didn't get to talk to Dr. Miriam. I'm going to reach out later. But we are carrying grief from the loss of contact. I used to drive to DC every month or so. I have not driven to DC in over a year. We are carrying grief um, from the loss of identity in a sense, right? Who are we now that we are unable to do or to be some of who we were before? We are carrying all kinds of grief. So our loss is not just the loss of life. We are carrying grief from loss in general. And that grief, as you mentioned, is compounded. So we are carrying grief, and some of us are carrying childhood grief, because the truth is that we have been socialized in a system that doesn't really allow for all of us to grieve, for all of us to connect to our emotions. And this year, in the last year, we have reached a point where we have been isolated to a certain extent with all of the grief that we've carried over the years. And so what do you do with that? One of the things that I have been doing is hosting grief cafes. And that is really just virtually allowing people a space to name their loss. And that sounds really simple on the sort of outset, name your loss. People say, well, you know, my aunt died, or someone died, or I lost my job. And then I have to sort of pause in that space and let people sit with silence for a moment and really think about what have you lost. Because losing your job is one thing, but what did losing your job mean? Losing your job may also mean a loss of a sense of security, which now means I have children, and the fact that I feel like I can't take care of my children means that I might lose my children. And so that is another, so having people actually name the loss, right? And then connect to the feeling associated with that loss. So creating spaces this is not just something that I do. This is something that I hope that I'm helping churches do. And someone put in the chat grief share, and I appreciate grief share. What I will say is that I am also interested in helping us, along with organizations like Grief Share, but I'm also looking for us to do sort of cultural grief opportunities as well. Opening grief opportunities that address our cultural nuances, that also address the sort of racial grief that we're carrying as a result of things that are happening in our communities as well. So not just the loss of life as a result of COVID, but the loss of life that's a result of sort of the systematic oppression that we are carrying. All of that has hit us in this season. And so for me, it is creating a space where we can name all of that out of our bellies, out of our own throats, and name our losses and connect to the emotion, because sometimes it's difficult to connect to the anger or the sadness when you have been disconnected from emotion for so long. When you are a part of a society that pushes you to victory, that pushes you to keep working, when you only get 3 days off from work, you know, that pushes you to move on, to connect to that emotion, to find the supports, even if it has to be virtual, to find the supports that you need to do this kind of work. And I also encourage people to reimagine the rituals. I know that, especially as it relates to sort of death, I know that we are accustomed to honoring death in a certain way, that sacred kind of remembering that we do as individuals and as a community. But in this season, we have had to be creative and use our imagination. And that's not something that we have done readily. We have sort of held on to those very important traditions that we've had. And I understand why, reasonably so. But in this season, how can we invite ourselves and others to imagine beyond what we have done for so long, so that we can remember and honor the loss and hold it in a way that allows us to mourn collectively, so that we can also move ahead collectively. And so that's some of the ways that I have worked in community to address this grief.
Really, really helpful. I wrote down Zoom vacation and grief cafe because I'm gonna have to work out how to incorporate both of those. So I'm wondering for both of you, and Dimitri, you can go first. What are some of the warning signs, right? Like what, and both of you, please address what are warning signs or ways that we can know that either we need more support or someone that we love needs more support in dealing with stress or grief or both?
So yes, some of the warning signs, well, before I do that, I love Grief Cafe. So I will talk to my sister, Dr. Jamie, about that. But creating the space to grieve and being okay with grieving in a different way is also important. So as she talked, I thought about that. As it relates to the signs that you're not quite okay, a lot of it comes when your eating habits are off, or you're eating more or less than is normal for you. You can't sleep, or you're sleeping too much. So when you talk about, or when you think about the extremes, I'm eating too much or too little, I'm sleeping too much or too little, pulling away from people when that's not your normal mode of operating, when you're, maybe a pretty social person, but you're finding that in this space and in this season and this time, you're actually pulling away and don't want to connect with people that you normally would want to connect with. Feeling hopeless and feeling helpless. I think when Dr. Jamie talked about when people are grieving and really pressing in to help them articulate what they actually have lost. Yes, I've lost an aunt, or I've lost a grandparent, or I've lost a parent or a sibling, but going further in that, I love what she said, and going further in that and having them sit sometimes even in that silent space to really understand, what does that really mean? So when, you've lost your job and there's a sense of hopelessness, and you now feel like, I can't do the things that I normally would do. And those things that you normally would do are things that you may not have given much thought to. They're just part of your routine. But now, when you're looking at those things that are changing, as I said, more sleep, not enough sleep, eating too much, not eating enough, low energy, isolating yourself when that wasn't a part of who you are and what your normal would be, having difficulty readjusting after perhaps someone that was in your life, that was important, that was a part of your everyday existence is gone. So when you're experiencing those things, some of those are normal. When you have a major shift or change or loss and you're grieving, those things can be normal for a period of time. But when you get into longer stretches of time, when those things are lasting week after week, that's the time where you want to look for assistance. And let me just say that for parents, it's important that you recognize these things in yourself, but it's also important that you recognize when these things are happening with your children. And some of the things you can look out for in children, if they seem withdrawn, or normally when they would want to play and play with siblings, or even neighbors, or what have you, when that is not something they want to do, when they normally would want to go to the playground, but they don't want to go to the playground anymore, when they are perhaps don't want to leave home, when that's not their normal way of acting or responding, when they are having difficulty concentrating. So all of these things are things that parents should pay attention to, because they can give you some sense of something's not quite right. And then there should be an evaluation to figure out, is this something that needs outside counsel? Do I need to reach out for additional resources and help? Or is this something where I can handle as a parent in talking, communicating with my child, and just listening and letting them know that everything's going to be okay, and really helping them to understand these are different times, but you're secure because you're able to do that. And if you're not able to do that, really reaching out for the resources that can help make sure that you're secure as well as them.
Yeah, and I really wouldn't add anything to what Dr. Demi mentioned. The only all of that, and if you aren't necessarily experiencing those things, but you just feel like you also want some additional support, right? Get that as well, because knowing that reaching out for support It's not a bad thing. It is okay, and she started with this. It's okay to feel that you're not okay. It's okay to say, I need some help. It's okay to reach out. So all of what she said. And when you feel like I'm just not doing my normal routine right, I don't feel like it. Maybe I don't feel like I'm at the extreme, but I just feel like I want some additional support, get some additional support. I think she's already covered all of the bases for us.
So I want us to end on hope. I was listening and thinking we just need a whole nother webinar on just this alone. We wanted to definitely touch on and at least raise it in this space because it is so important. But as we try to give us some tips for staying encouraged, for how to negotiate these spaces, you started to touch on those, but what would you offer in terms of, how we can just help ourselves to stay encouraged, and also when we see that we might be spiraling a little bit, any advice that or wisdom that you have about what we can do to intervene for ourselves or intervene for others?
Yeah,
So, okay, go ahead, Dr.
I have a t-shirt made. I serve as a chaplain in a level 1 trauma center in Philadelphia. And we're not really allowed to wear t-shirts unless they have like the hospital logo. So I have a t-shirt made and then I get the hospital logo on the back. And the t-shirt says, it's okay to admit you're not okay. And so I put like little things like that on the t-shirt. So first thing, all of us are going through this stuff, and you define what this stuff is, right? At varying levels of it. And so if you feel like you are not okay, do not think that that is odd. Do not feel like you are alone. It is okay. Like that is normal, that is common. Sometimes it's easy for us to feel like we are the only one who is not handling things well. Like I'm not handling this well. I'm not parenting well. I'm not being a good facilitator, a good whatever your thing is. It's easy to think you are not doing it well. No, you're fine. We're all trying to make our way through this. We're all trying to navigate our way through. So to give ourselves some grace. It's easy for us to be compassionate and gentle with other people. That same compassion and gentleness that we often are able to extend to others, I encourage us to extend that to ourselves. So the way that we can say, oh, it's okay, you've done a good job, to do that to ourselves, to find ways to laugh with ourselves, to pause for a moment, to take a deep breath. And I know that sounds like it's really simple, but we often run from place to place and are very busy during the course of our day, on and off Zoom, whether we are on Zoom or actually face to face with people. It is easy to run throughout the course of your day and to actually not pause long enough to take in a deep breath. So I encourage people every day to pause and take in a deep breath, to be gentle with yourself, to know that you are not in this thing alone, that if you actually reach out to the person next to you, they are in it just as deep as you are. And to recognize that you might be having a sort of a crisis of faith. You might wonder how you got in this mess. You might have some questions for God, your God. I have some questions for your God and my God too. That is okay. Whatever your affirmation is that gets you through the day, to hold on to that. If that is your sacred text, let that be it. If that is a song, then let that be it. What gets you through the day, hold on to that and remember that. And get yourself some good friends who can remind you every day that you are doing your best. I think if it wasn't for a community of people who every day were like, Jay, listen, you did your best, who can laugh with me, I probably wouldn't have gotten through some of the tougher times of this pandemic. So those are just a few things that I would share.
So those are exceptional. I concur with everything that Dr. Jamie has expressed. I will say that to add to that, there's a quote that I have posted in different places. It's give yourself the same care and attention that you give to others and watch yourself bloom. And Dr. Jamie touched on this, how it can be easy sometimes to care for others and to extend grace to others, but we don't always do that for ourselves. And so it's critical that you take it easy on yourself. And as she has already expressed, this is not easy for any of us to get through. We're all having to learn different ways to exist and different ways to do things. And you know, it can be a little, you know, what you call nerve-wracking. But some of the things that I would recommend to get you over the hump, to get you through the day, listen to good music. Put on something that makes you dance and just, you know, it can be something that I sometimes would put on the electric slide, because when we think about the electric slide, we're usually at what? A wedding or an outing or a family reunion, something that's usually joyous. Go to YouTube, put on the electric slide, get in your floor and give yourself a good dance for 10, 15 minutes. It is wonderful. Put on a movie, a comedy. Go watch, you know, what's the new one out with Eddie Murphy? Coming to America 2.
Yeah.
I just recommended that to my son and a couple of friends. Go laugh. We are dealing with so many serious things in our lives every day. Laugh. Allow yourself to laugh. It is medicine for your soul. So simple things. Sometimes we overthink and we think it has to be something major or big. It doesn't. One of the other things I will say is, on the days where the weather is good, of course, in the DC area, we've had some really cold days. We've had a few really nice days. On the days when it's 65 and above and the sun is shining, get out and do a good walk. Allow yourself to see the flowers and see the trees and smell the grass and see all of God's good creation. And so again, something simple, something easy, something that you have access to, doing a walk, getting in your floor, putting on good music to dance, putting on, I love Richard Smallwood songs, and I can't sing, but I get in my floor and I pretend that I can sing. And so when my children are home, they're just like, oh Lord, here she goes again. But I just have a blast thinking or pretending I can sing, up in the floor, just singing the goodness of God and how good he has been, even though we're going through, and in spite of all that we're going through, he still has us here. So he still has good things for us to do. So those are just a few of the things: taking a walk, getting up, dancing. Some people like to journal, making sure that you are caring for yourself. And then you may want to go take a bubble bath. And just, we're going so fast every day, just stopping to take a bath rather than jumping in the shower and jumping out real quick. Take time to just breathe. And lastly, I'll say, in regards to taking time to breathe, breathing exercises really make a difference. And they slow your heart rate. They make everything just come to a state of calmness. And so doing daily breathing exercises is also great. And then I'll say, one of the things that my neighbors and I do is I like to cook, and I do a lot of baking. So I'll bake something. It's only my husband and I home now because our children are away at school. And I'll bake enough to share, and they'll do the same. So we can't spend time in each other's homes, but we can pass, something good to eat over the fence or from door to door. So just finding ways to honor yourself, give yourself grace, finding ways to laugh, finding ways to get some exercise in and move. And just those little things can give you the hope that you need to make it to the next day.
Amen. That's so very helpful. A question that just came in the chat that I think we should answer as we come to a close is, when someone feels that they're at the end of their road, when would we, and this is from someone who is a clergy person, when would we refer them out? When would we refer them to others?
Well, I would say that you refer before the end of the rope. And obviously, if it's somebody that's at the end of the rope, call someone immediately. I know at Metropolitan, we have the IAMA ministry that is available and ready, you know, at any time to be of assistance. Not every church has a counseling ministry, but you can certainly, like I said, reach out to IAMA. I know at least, I haven't checked on this lately, but for example, Reed Temple has a counseling center. So understand whether you have a counseling facility in your actual church. If you don't, you can reach out to other centers, because while we are IAMA and we serve the congregation at Metropolitan, we also serve the community. And so there are, I can certainly send to you, Dr. Leslie, a list of organizations that give pro bono counseling. I do have that type of list as well, that are in the city and in Maryland. I don't know that I have a lot that's in Virginia, but I'm happy to share that. There are so many resources available. What I would say is get the person help right away. And if it's a critical situation where someone is at their wits' end and you think their life is in danger and you can't get to them, call 911. Yeah. Call 911, because you want to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to make sure that people don't feel like, you know, they need to take their life. They're at their wits' end so much that they need to take their life. Let's get them the help that they need immediately, and then get them on a plan whereby, you know, they can really recover and really receive the resources and the help that they need.
Dr. Jamie, did you want to add to that?
No, well, I didn't know if the person was saying that they were providing sort of counseling for someone and they wanted to know when to reach out. So I would just say, if this is a congregation where sort of we're providing, ministers are providing sort of pastoral counseling or counseling, to know what your gift and your strengths are. Absolutely. So that you know when to provide sort of a referral. Because unless you are sort of trained in counseling or clinical pastoral education or things, knowing what your gift is so that you're able to do the referral prior to the person getting to the end of their rope is something that I would recommend as well.
Yeah, that's great.
I completely concur.
Are ordained have, you can do 3 sessions and then you should refer out. But again, I do agree, if there's some emergency or if you feel like, I'm not sure, just 911 or refer out immediately. Thank you both so much. We could, and yes, Javon Billups Reverend Billups has just put the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That is so important. Thank you for adding that. This has been just so important. I thank you both for your patience and for just giving us those nuggets of wisdom. I know early on in the pandemic, and every once in a while, when I would wash my hands for 20 seconds, I was sort of obsessing about 20 seconds as opposed to whatever. I would sing and dance around just to kind of break up the monotony of the 20 seconds. So all of those things will help us get through. And I love what you all have said. It's okay not to be okay. And then we're all in this together. Like we're in this together and we can get through it together.
And it's okay to reach out for help.
Amen. It is okay, even for clergy and faith leaders.
Absolutely.
It is okay for all of us to reach out for help. So
you need to be poured into so that you can actually pour out and help others.
So thank you all. This brings us to the end of our COVID vaccine. I was saying today, it's all things COVID, all things vaccine, all things pandemic. And I think, I hope you have felt enriched by this time of sharing together. We will rebroadcast this evening on both YouTube and Facebook at 7. So you can feel free to share links and let other people know. I am so grateful for every participant that we've had. This has just been wonderful and rich. And I feel like we probably need a part 2 and a part 3 as well. I see someone asking if we can save the chat, and we will do that and try to figure out a way to share that as well. So thank you all so much. I want to just close with a very quick prayer. because I believe so much has been shared that we should do that as well. So if you will join me and take a breath even as we have been instructed. God, we thank you for this time of sharing. We thank you for every panelist, for every word of wisdom, for every word of encouragement, and for all that you're doing even now in our lives to fortify us and edify us and uplift us. We pray, God, that you would help us to remember that we are in this together and that we are here to help one another, to look out for one another, to care for one another. And God, remind us that we have to also care for ourselves. Be with us, God, as we look for ways to take vaccines and make vaccines available to others. We pray, God, that for our medical professionals, for our mental health professionals, for our faith leaders and clergies, all those who are working so hard to encourage people, to keep them safe, to keep them healthy, and to keep them whole. And God, we commit all the things that are out of our control to you. Do what only you can. Bless and keep us in all these things, we ask. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all so much for joining us, for hanging in here with us, and we look forward to being together again soon. God bless you.
God bless.